Hello. MI6, officially known as the Secret Intelligence Service, came into existence in the early years of the 20th century. Since that time, its fortunes have fluctuated dramatically. After early successes that helped to establish its reputation worldwide, a succession of scandals and disasters so seriously undermined the service as to render it almost impotent. Not until the 1960s, when the service was reorganized and restructured in the wake of Kim Philby's defection, did MI6 recover some of its lost prestige and its legendary effectiveness as an intelligence-gathering organization. In the following decades, it went on to achieve some spectacular successes, among them the recruitment of Oleg Penkovsky and Oleg Gordievsky. This series of programs brings together a number of experts in the field of intelligence and its application to Cold War diplomacy. Over the course of the series, I will be asking them for their own personal recollections and views on some of the critical events and intelligence operations that help define the world we live in today. In the first of our series of interviews, I'll be talking to Robert Cecil. During a distinguished career in the Foreign Service, Mr. Cecil worked closely with MI6 and served, following the departure of Donald Maclean, as First Secretary with the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. He is also the author of an account of the wartime operations of MI6. Robert, I'd like to begin by asking you about the early years of MI6, particularly the interwar years when the service suffered, I think you'll agree, from a certain amount of official neglect. Could you tell me a little of the difficulties and problems faced by MI6 in this period?
I think the history of MI6, ever since it came under the Foreign Office in 1921 or 22, has been a sad one, really, and one of neglect for which the Foreign Office is very largely to blame, the Foreign Office and the Treasury. The Treasury to blame for cutting funds and failing to realize that intelligence cannot be turned on and off as with a tap. You've got to do, as the NKVD and the future KGB did, plan long ahead. Get people domiciled in countries and activated then at a later date. You can't suddenly produce people overnight who are then going to prove to be responsible intelligence agents. And the whole history of MI6 in the 30s is one of improvisation. So the first trouble was the financial trouble. The second trouble was that the Foreign Office regarded MI6 as a very uneasy bed companion. They demanded cover for agents abroad, and this, after all, is very understandable at a time when radio transmission was very primitive, and even after all, the outbreak of war in 1939, the average transmission set was about the size of a small suitcase. So you had to have people undercover in British missions abroad who could send their messages back home. But this annoyed embassies for two reasons. First, that if a man was caught, as happened, for example, to Kenrick, the passport control officer in Austria when Hitler took Austria, then the whole embassy was under threat. There may be more than one bad apple in the barrel. And secondly, the ambassador had no control over what was being transmitted, and for all he knew, the agent or the passport control officer was transmitting something directly contrary to his political advice. In fact, that is one of the points of having a secret intelligence service, that you are not wholly dependent for your political advice on the ambassador or minister or whoever is head of mission, who may have gone native and been completely converted to the country in which he's living. So the Foreign Office, therefore, were reluctant to give good cover to MI6. Everybody knew passport control officers were MI6 people. And They were also, some ambassadors simply refused to have an MI6 man. There was no MI6 man in Moscow because the ambassador, I think it was Seeds, William Seeds, wouldn't have him. When the war broke out, Switzerland, which was a key neutral country, there was no MI6 man in Bern because the minister, George Warner, I think it was, wouldn't have one. They did have a man in Geneva under consular cover, but that was not so satisfactory. So this was one of the reasons why MI6 set up what is sometimes called the Z organization, organized by Claude Dancy, which was to use what you might call natural cover, journalists, the Korda Film Organization, the Citral Wine Company. Many of these organizations, for patriotic or other reasons, allowed their members to work for MI6. But the two organizations came together at the beginning of the war, and then the disastrous episode occurred at Venlo on the Dutch border. The Venlo incident was a real disaster from the British point of view. It wasn't a disaster constructed by MI6 because they were acting with the approval of Lord Halifax as Foreign Secretary and Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister. They believed they were in touch with a German general who was prepared to act against Hitler. But when the two representatives reached the Dutch border, they were abducted. And they told everything. We've seen the German documents since, and they revealed everything they knew. So that SIS, at the beginning of the war, was virtually starting in Europe from scratch.
Would it be true then to say that many of the setbacks suffered by MI6, both during and after the war, trace their origin to this period?
If we look at the SIS disasters, I think we have to see that a good deal of this is due to defective recruitment. I've already mentioned that the SIS was starved of funds between the wars. This meant that when the threat of war with Germany came, there had to be very rapid expansion of SIS and also of Bletchley. Now, Bletchley was so largely recruited from universities that they seem to have been fortunate. Apart from a spell down in Bletchley by Cairncross, they don't seem to have recruited any young people who were ideologically attached to communism. The universities hadn't developed into the universities that they became in the 60s. In the 30s, they were mainly middle class. But SIS had to recruit very rapidly, and because they didn't use the ordinary civil service procedure or anything of the kind, they recruited on what's called the old boy basis. The classic example of this was the recruitment of Philby, who was recruited by Vivian, who was then head of the SIS counterintelligence, on the basis of having known his father, the explorer, St. John Philby. This, in fact, should have been no recommendation at all, since senior Philby had left the Indian Civil Service and become a Muslim and become a bigamist and become a fascist. So he wasn't much of an advertisement, but nevertheless, it was considered that he was suitable material. They recruited others into Section 5, one who has recently written a book called Desmond Bristow, who seems to have had no qualifications at all, as is proved by his book, except that he could speak Spanish, and they needed someone speaking Spanish. And the justification for some of these recruitments, that they were short of time and they needed men, doesn't really explain the problem. Burgess is another example. Burgess was a friend of Guy Liddell, senior official in MI5. And Guy Liddell seems, because Burgess was a friend of Guy Liddell, they thought, well, he must be all right. He was taken on into the Foreign Office by Hector McNeill when he was Minister of State and became his private secretary. And we know what resulted from that. Now, these errors of recruitment were compounded by the fact that SIS didn't have any proper training establishment. This, again, in the 1930s, they wouldn't have had the resources to set up a serious training establishment. On the other hand, when SOE was created, the first thing they did was to set up a training establishment. The establishment down at Bewley was the one where Philby was employed at first, before he was transferred to Section 5 as an expert warfare. He was then transferred to Section 5 for the reason I gave earlier, namely that they were desperately short of Spanish-speaking people, and Philby, of course, had been in Spain during the Civil War. The only area where SIS set up a proper training station was in Canada, where it was set up by Little Bill Stevenson, the head of British Security Coordination, where in British Security Coordination, functions of MI6, MI5, and OSCE, and the Political Warfare Executive were all included. And this training establishment was also widely used by OSS, so that had a very valuable function. But SIS, this is an aspect of the defects of Menzies as an administrator, was that they never got around to setting up a proper training establishment where some of the defects of the recruitment policy might have been ironed out.
Of course, one of the great catastrophes for MI6 was Kim Philby, whom you've mentioned. What can you tell me about Philby as a British intelligence officer and his value as a spy to the Soviet Union?
Philby was certainly one of the greatest spies in history, I think. The only other man probably of equal importance working for the Soviet Union was probably Richard Zorga in Japan. The importance of Zorga was that he was able to warn the Russians that the Japanese were going south and not going to attack Russia in 1941, which enabled them to move troops from the Far East, the defense of Moscow. Philby, I think, must be reckoned as one of the greatest spies in history because he became head of the very organization which was supposed to be operating against communism. And then he was able, in that capacity, to destroy a very important Soviet defector named Volkov, who tried to defect in Istanbul. And then, of course, in Washington by 1941, he came, after the defection of Burgess and Maclean, came under suspicion of the Americans, who refused to keep him there any longer. And because the British couldn't prove anything against him at that time, and later, mistakenly in my belief, brought him back into their employment as a kind of stringer in the Middle East, Beirut, he added greatly to the tension within the Anglo-American intelligence community, which, as I mentioned earlier, was already in a rather aggravated state because of Hoover's being incensed about the handling of the Fuchs case and the mishandling of the Maclean-Burgess case. So Philby, in all those senses, was a British disaster and Soviet success. But even the best spies make mistakes, and Philby made this disastrous mistake of maintaining a very close relationship with Burgess. And this is what did him down, because when he was in Washington in 1948, and received a letter from Burgess saying, "I'm coming out to Washington." Philby decided that Burgess would do less harm under his roof than on his own, and took him into his house, much to the distress of Mrs. Philby. And this meant, of course, that when Burgess left, and Philby's final words in Washington to Burgess when he was flung out of the British Embassy was, "Don't you go too." In other words, don't go with Maclean, who he was supposed to be warning. This really put an end to Philby's usefulness, because although it took MI6 a little time to come to terms with Philby as a potential spy, his main usefulness to the Russians was at an end.
Robert, you mentioned another great Soviet success, Donald Maclean, who was your predecessor as first secretary in Washington. What were your impressions of him as a diplomat and as a spy?
Maclean was a very remarkable man. He'd got first at Cambridge, and the Russians who, picking up their spies in Cambridge, were taking at first only people of the highest intellectual caliber. Cairncross passed first in the civil service and diplomatic exam. Burgess was regarded as first-class material. The only one who didn't make it better than a second was Philby. But Maclean also had this very engaging characteristic of appearing to be very frank and candid. With his fair hair and blue eyes and his Scottish ancestry, people were easily taken in. This emerged at his first interview because he was known at Cambridge as a communist. He told me he was a communist. I knew he'd been a communist at Cambridge. And when he was interviewed by the Civil Service Board, somebody said to him, "We hear you had very leftward leanings at Cambridge." And Maclean said, "Yes, it's true, and I haven't really altogether got over it. It's a struggle between the heart and the head." And this engaging reply at a time when we had 3 million unemployed in this country and nobody knew what to do about it was considered to be perfectly satisfactory. There is no doubt that up to a point, Maclean served two governments to the satisfaction of both, whereas many of us had great difficulty in serving even one. And if it hadn't been for the Venona mistake, the fact that Philby was keeping Maclean informed of the progress of the investigation, and that by the time Maclean had turned up in Cairo as councillor and head of chancellery, the investigation was catching up with him. And this caused him to take to the bottle in such a way that his whole behaviour deteriorated. And I think otherwise they would probably have had great difficulty in catching him.
Exactly how damaging to the British government was Maclean?
When Macmillan was challenged in the House of Commons at a later date, debating the disappearance of Maclean, he explained how the head of the American department was not a person of very great importance. He didn't deal with NATO, he didn't deal with the American economic relations and matters of that kind. And I thought ruefully how it had explained to me when I took over after Maclean that I was inheriting a position of grave importance at a critical moment. But that was, in fact, Macmillan's remarks were not to the point, because the point is not what executive position a spy holds, but what information he has access to. And I knew perfectly well, from having been instructed to examine Maclean's steel filing cabinet after his disappearance, that in that steel filing cabinet was a cabinet paper which should have been returned to the cabinet officers, in which Prime Minister Attlee gave a full and detailed account of his visit to Washington in the attempt to dissuade President Truman. The persuasion was not necessary, but they thought it was, not to drop the atomic bomb in the course of the Korean War. So that what Maclean had access to was the important factor.
Following the great disasters of Philby, Maclean, and Burgess, how did MI6 react?
The Foreign Office had realized, after the defection of Burgess and Maclean, first that their own security was defective, and the very small security department in the Foreign Office was greatly strengthened. And they put Sir Patrick Riley, who had had long experience, wartime experience in SIS, as the Assistant Undersecretary in charge of what had become the Permanent Undersecretary's Department in the Foreign Office. And he took in hand various questions that had been neglected in SIS, such as making service pensionable. What should be a proper retirement age for a service which required young, predominantly young and active men? What should be the frequency with which people should be moved from place to place, or the extent to which they should be left in one place with the risks that that entailed, so on. All these questions of cover. The old blown cover of passport control officer was no longer satisfactory. All these questions were taken in hand. And he also arranged for the Foreign Office post within SIS, which had not been filled after my departure in April 1945, to be filled again. Now, a further major change took place in 1956 for a more or less extraneous reason, connected with the visit of Khrushchev to this country in a Russian cruiser which docked at Portsmouth. And Eden had said that this was the first visit Khrushchev had ever made abroad, let alone the first visit to Britain. There were to be no mishaps. Nobody was to be sent to examine the hull of this cruiser or any other attempts of that kind. SIS very unwisely ignored this and sent down Commander Crabb, who did not survive the experience. Nor did the head of SIS. The Foreign Office advisor who had failed to veto this operation was also removed. And Eden, who was the Prime Minister, in his rage at what had happened and the humiliation to which we had been exposed, having to apologize to the Russians, did the unthinkable and replaced the head of SIS, General Sinclair, by Sir Dick White from MI5. And this was like putting, in the eyes of MI6, this was like putting the manager of a 3rd Division club in charge of the Manchester United. It didn't look like that to everybody, but that's how it looked to MI6, where there were still people who were by no means convinced of Philby's guilt. This is in 1956. The late Sir Dick White was an extremely able officer, and he survived the storm. He took control of MI6, he improved relations with MI5, he did an absolutely first-class job. And he gradually weeded out the Philby adherents, who, of course, had been finally convinced by the defection of Philby in 1963. So by this time, SIS was, by a combination of different developments, put on a completely new footing. And the links with the Foreign Office became very, very much closer, particularly a very close tie-up with the Permanent Undersecretary's Department, and indeed may be said to have culminated in the appointment of a senior Foreign Office Undersecretary, Sir John Rennie, as head of MI6. This was not a particularly successful appointment, but we needn't go into that. But by this time, at last, as compared with the neglect of MI6 by the Foreign Office in the 20s and 30s, at last you had a very close working relationship.
Given what you've said, what was it like for MI6 during the 1940s and 50s? Could it ever give the British government reliable information on Soviet intentions?
I think the late 40s and early 50s was a very difficult period. I don't think that we were getting really first-class information out of Soviet Union until Penkovsky came along. Certainly, we were getting nothing comparable to what the Soviet Union were getting out of us. For example, Maclean in Washington was able to report to the Soviet Union that there were no contingency plans to defend Berlin. Therefore, the Russians were able to concentrate pressure to isolate Berlin, which again could have led to an absolute disaster. It is possible that Maclean also advised them that at that time we didn't wish war and that we were genuine in saying that the aircraft which were forming the Berlin airlift, bringing supplies into Berlin to beat the Soviet blockade, were all unarmed. And the Russians on their side kept in being the four-power air safety center at Berlin, which was controlling traffic in and out of Berlin, which we were able to accept as an indication that they didn't want war. So this foreshadowed Cuba as an example of crisis management. But I think there was a desperate lack of intelligence at that time about Soviet thinking, which at the time of the Cuban crisis later was to some extent remedied by Penkovsky.
Finally, Robert, I'd like to finish off with the role of Penkovsky. Could you tell me a bit more about him and his role in maintaining the peace throughout the critical years of the Cold War? Exactly how important was he?
Penkovsky was obviously a man of crucial importance at the time of the Cuban crisis. So much so that those who depreciate the importance of intelligence have cast doubt on whether Penkovsky was a genuine agent in place, or whether he wasn't to some extent being used by the Russians, and it has even been suggested that he wasn't executed. Gordievsky, I think, has made clear that this is all nonsense. Penkovsky was of vital importance, I think, at the time of the Cuban crisis, and that if it hadn't been for his information, both about the weaknesses of the Soviet nuclear arsenal, but at the same time the threat that this posed, that Kennedy might have not been able to pull off the successful negotiation with Khrushchev, which has really coloured the whole subsequent period, because once not only a hotline been established between the American president and the man in the Kremlin, but that there had actually been links between these two important figures which had prevented possibly Third World War. it became possible to build on that foundation and to build in a number of other safeguards which mercifully have proved effective.
Robert Cecil, thank you very much indeed.